Yeah, can.
Can,
Affirmative.
Okay, thank you everybody. So good morning guys. So I'm Costa Officer Grade 5 Xing Hui, and I'll be giving a lecture on program planning and execution. So if at any point of time I speak too quickly or if you all have questions, then just ask directly, okay? So we have to be clear on the module objectives because this is what you'll be tested and graded on. So you need to understand the importance of proper planning, execution, describe the components of planning for an event, draft an event proposal, and lastly, apply the skills and knowledge learned for your core activities. So all these I'll elaborate further in my lecture. So the importance of planning. So program planning is about considering various factors and putting in place different steps to achieve objectives. So it helps to increase efficiency and effectiveness, facilitate proper coordination and control, facilitate decision making, aids in organizing, and encourages creativity and innovation. So as I said earlier, you need to know what the components of planning are, right? So before the event, right, you have to come up with a proposal which consists of objectives, the committee, a work plan, budgeting, risk management, action plan. So like what I said, the proposal, right? Okay. So I'll elaborate further on each of the components. So if you are unsure of what, example, a work plan is, then you can just pay attention. Then later I will dive into it. So next will be during the event, it will simply be the execution of the event. And lastly, after the event, we'll do an after action review. So first, I will share a bit more about objectives. So it is important to provide clear directions when planning and set benchmarks and targets to aim for. So hence, it is important that they are SMART. So what exactly is SMART? Objectives have to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. So you can now take a read. So I'll explain each part in more details in the subsequent slides. So what do we mean by specific? So when you come up with objective, you need to ask yourself whether the objective proposed is precise and well-defined, whether it's clear, concise, and easily understood. So we can take a look over here for a positive and a negative example. Yeah. So next is measurable. So how will you or your participants know whether the objective is achieved? So using my current lecture as an example, if I only state that I want all of you to learn how to plan activity, I won't be able to properly judge whether you all actually learned how to plan the activity. But if I want to measure whether my objectives have been met, I will expect you all to be able to describe, for example, the components of planning. So it's a very measurable objective. So achievable, you need to think whether your objective is within the capabilities of your participants to meet the objective. So will they be able to access the required resources to ensure that this objective can happen? So like, as you see in the example, the negative example will be all participants will become leaders after attending the course. This not only is this objective very vague because you just say all will become leaders, but becoming a leader is a process basically. So it's not exactly achievable, but if you break it down into smaller pieces, you say that, oh, I want the course to be able to guide the participants to have a better understanding of leadership styles and techniques. Then it's more specific and it's achievable because we break it down into smaller, you dissect it into smaller pieces. So next, you need to see whether your objective align with the overall goal or is it random. And lastly, we want to see whether your objective is timely. So what's the deadline you're setting and is it feasible? So if you look at the given example, instead of vaguely saying that the participants will learn how to dress a wound, it will be more accurate and useful to state that they will learn how to dress a wound by the second week of the workshop. So you give yourself a timeline, a deadline to meet. So this is what it means by having a timely objective. Yep. So far, so good. If too fast or anything, then you can type in the chat. So I will slow down. Or if you have questions, you can also ask. So maybe now we'll do a short quiz. So first question, which of the following is a specific objective? Is it A or B? You can just quickly type in the chat your answer. Oh, I see an overwhelming response B. Yep. Okay. I think quite straightforward lah, because obviously B is way more specific, because if you just say you want the students to learn what St. John does as a CCA, it's very big because we do a lot of things, right? But if you want to teach the student, you have to inform the students that, oh, so the main things that we do is first aid, TOC, home nursing, then in this way is way more specific, like what you want to achieve. So next question, which of the following is a measurable objective? Yeah, you all can continue to send answers in. Okay, very good. Seems like everyone got it lah. So answer is A. So it's very easy to say, oh, I want my event to be successful. But then how exactly do you know your event is successful or not? So in using this example, having a CCA open house, for example, one way to measure the successfulness is whether you achieve a high rate of sign-ups. So sign-ups being students indicating their interest in the CCA. So the more, obviously, it means that your event is successful, your open house is successful. So that's what it means. So next, I will move on to committee. So we form a committee because it increases efficiency, and your manpower is divided into smaller branches with teams in charge of specific tasks. So there's admin, logistics, safety, ops. These are the common committees that will be formed. However, if the program you are planning for is a small scale one, such as a practical first aid lesson or a theory first aid lesson, you can combine some of the committees together because there are less details that needs to be taken care of. So example, you have people in charge of your administrative work. They can also oversee safety because there's no conflict between these two committees. You can actually do both roles at the same time lah. So the following slides will be the job scope of each committee. You can just take a look briefly. So administration is things like your attendance taking, basically what like secretaries do, right? So keeping our valuables, being in charge of like timelines, everything, keeping track of documents, basically doing the paperwork. Yeah. So logistics, as what the name suggests, is to purchase the required logistics and plan out how you are going to better allocate your logistics. And logistics can also mean like your meal. So safety, likewise, basically oversee the safety. So you see the first point form, right? I mentioned it states risk and hazard assessment. So later I will go more into details. So every time you plan for an event, you want to basically, in a way, I would say predict what are the possible risks involved with planning for this activity. So be it games day, people falling down or sprains, all these are things that we should plan in advance, think of like what risk control measures we can come up with. So later I will talk more about it. So essentially safety is important. Yeah. So next will be operations. So operation is basically the flow of the event, the committee planning for the activities for this specific event. Okay. So next I will talk about the work plan. So a work plan clearly marks out the various deadlines and responsibilities during the planning phase. It is very helpful in delegating and detailing out the necessary tasks. So it should be able to show the various readers various tasks at hand, inform who must carry them out, and by when the task should be completed. So if you take a look at this slide, it's very straightforward. So if you take a look at it, it simulates the deadlines, things that each stakeholder needs to complete. So example, if you take a look at serial number 2, right, you can clearly see that the finalized activities must be confirmed by 16 May. And who is in charge of it? The operations committee. So very clear, like if you know you're in operations, the operations committee, you take a look at the work plan, you know what you have to do. So typically a work plan is better to be more detailed. Yeah. So this is just a very simple example for you to take a look at. So next, I will move on to budgeting. So a budget plan allows you to determine in advance whether you have enough money for your event. So this is an example of a budget plan. It is very useful in helping you visualize specific items required for each purpose and whether the same item can be reused for another activity so you can cut costs. So for example, if you know that you need ground sheets for two separate activities that will be executed at different timings, so you can coordinate and reuse the ground sheets instead of buying or getting another set. So basically this saves resources, saves money. So it is worth noting that it'll be easier for your planning team and whoever's reading your proposal or slides to be able to reference your budgeting plans to your logistical needs conveniently. So sometimes we might split our logistics list on one slide, then we put our budgeting plan on another slide. But if you combine it, actually, it is way clearer, essentially. So next will be venue. Venue is really straightforward. So these are the factors you need to consider. So first, obviously, is whether the location is available and whether you're allowed to use the place. So if you want to use, example, multi-purpose hall in your school, you have to book it through the management, your school management. So you need to see whether your venue allows your program to take place. So if you want to do, example, food drill training session for maybe 2 to 3 teams, then obviously a classroom would be too small. You rather use places like the parade square, right? Space constraint rules and regulations, etc. And what are the possible risks and whether it allows for contingency plans to happen. So for contingency plan, I'll also elaborate more in later slides. Yeah, so this was what I was talking about for risk management. So risk management ensures the availability of safety personnel, assesses risks involving all stakeholders, and includes contingency plans should certain situations occur. So your contingency plans are basically your plan Bs in the event of emergency situations. So a different set of instructions should be ready since emergency situations allow little time for decision making. So such as wet weather. So you never know when it might rain, right? Or when there might be lightning or unhealthy haze levels. So, but every time you plan for an event, especially if it's outdoors, you should always plan for wet weather plan. So in the event where it really rains or it's really Cat 1, you can have a separate plan basically. So wet weather plans, right, are a subset of the contingency plans. So contingency is really just planning for unforeseen circumstances, but you just try to think of different situations based on past experience. So your security response plan, it involves the detailed procedure of how to respond to cases of emergency which would endanger the safety of the people present. So for instance, right? So for instance, in case where one of your cadet gets into an accident and requires medical coverage, so because you plan in advance, so you know exactly the treatment and the evacuation plan, how it will be executed. So I'll cover a bit on risk and assessment. How do you exactly plan for it? So these are some of the examples of possible risks. So I would like to bring your attention to the hazard and possible accident / ill health portion. So basically, right, hazard is anything that can cause harm. So example, chemical, electricity, sharp objects. And the possible accident ill health is what might occur due to these hazards. So as you can see in this example shown, right, the hazard is a slippery floor, and the possible accident is that trainees might slip and fall, injuring themselves. So risk is the chances that someone will be harmed by the hazard and the possible accident. So you see all these numbers, right? It looks complicated, but actually the main focus for this lesson, right, is to allow you guys to be able to plan for basically think of what are the possible hazards available rather than going into very specific details on risk evaluation per se. Yeah. So this is an example of a matrix used to calculate the risk level of possible hazard identified. So if you just search a risk and hazard assessment matrix, right, on Google, actually you'll be able to find many of this kind of matrix. So it provides you with a guide lah. So going back to my previous slide, So how you fill in a risk and assessment table, right, is simply first you list out the activities that you are doing, you identify possible hazards. So example, if you know that you have to do some craft work, you know that you'll be handling with scissors, a pen knife, etc., then you know that the hazard is sharp objects. Then afterwards, you evaluate the risk level based on severity and likelihood. So severity just means how severe it will be if someone actually gets injured from the sharp object. And likelihood is what are the chances of it happening. So using the sharp object as an example, it can be very severe if someone accidentally cuts themselves with a pen knife per se. But then the likelihood of it happening is low because most of you guys are secondary school cadets. You all have handled scissors, pen knife, so you all know that to take note, to be careful with it while using it. So going back to my slide, risk control is basically what the safety committee plans to mitigate the risk. So obviously you cannot foresee someone might actually get injured by the sharp knife, but then what you can do is to remind the cadets, the trainees, to be careful that there's sharp objects around. So when you handle it, please handle it with care. So something like that. So this is what risk control means, trying to mitigate the hazard and possible accidents. So next, I'll move on to action plans. So your action plans detail out the specific actions that have to be taken by different stakeholders during the execution phase. And it ensures that members are clear of their responsibilities. So previously, I talked about a work plan, then now this is action plan. So in previous courses, some cadets are confused between these two. So you just need to remember this. For your work plan, is for stakeholders planning for the event during the planning phase to have a clear deadline, list of roles and responsibilities during the planning phase. Whereas for your action plan, it is for during execution. So on the day itself, your NCOs, when they look at the timeline, right, as the example you see, it's very clear. So for your platoon ICs, they know that at 800 hours, they need to take attendance. Your class IC know that he or she has to conduct a water parade, specifically at this timing during first parade. Yeah. So it should be as detailed and clear as possible. So whoever receives it must immediately understand what they have to do. So example, I know that I'm an NCO. So when I look at this whole list of action plan for the day of activity, right, I know, oh, my responsibility for this day at this time is to collect the valuables of the cadets. Yeah. Yeah. So moving next will be writing a proposal. So this is what your program planning is about, right? It's about planning for your event and putting it out into a document. So your proposal is used to propose and seek approval for the activity. It helps to justify and outline your information of your program. So you take a read at the things you should include in the proposal. So most of the things that you have to include in your proposals were the components of planning that I have previously introduced to you. So obviously, when you have a proposal, usually we do it in Word document form, right? So you start off with a title, you introduce what your event is about, you include basic details such as date, time, venue, then you come up with why do I want to have this activity? So that's your objective and your aims, right? Then you start describing, including your timeline, roles and responsibilities, etc. So up to this point, if you have never written a proposal for any event, right? Don't be too afraid. So later we'll do a short activity so that y'all can be more familiar with coming out with a proposal. So we do a short recap. Y'all can unmute yourself, which I don't think anyone will want to, right? But y'all can type in the chat also, what does SMART stand for? Anyone? Okay, yep, keep it coming. Yeah. So I see most of the answers are correct, similar. So yeah, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. So let's take note. I see quite a few people put realistic instead of relevant. So the actual term for your R stands for relevant. So you just try to remember this. Okay. Okay, so next question. Is a work plan used for planning or execution? Yeah, thank you, Daryl, sir. Realistic is covered under achievable. Oh, okay, very good. Can tell that everyone has been listening. Yeah, it's used in the planning phase. So third, can you all list out 3 components of planning that you have learned so far? Just a quick one. I've shared quite a few components, right? Can you all just come up with a few? Can you help me plug this in? I go over there. Okay, so you all just take a look at the answer. So we mentioned some people write proposal. So essentially, the proposal is a consolidation, or rather a detailed planning, like why for the components of planning. So components of planning, they are objective, committee, work plan, budget, venue, action plan, etc. But proposal is what you write inside, what you present to, example, your TICs or your officers. But yeah, thank you for the responses. So next, I'll talk about execution. So what happens on the day itself. So during the execution, a pre-activity brief is necessary to ensure that the flow of activities is according to plan and that stakeholders are aware of what they need to do. So this brings us back to what I mentioned earlier about the action plan. So if your action plan is detailed and clear enough, it will sufficiently aid your execution phase because everyone will understand what they have to do for each activity just by looking at whatever you have written in your action plan. Yeah, so far so good, right? So next, I'll talk about the reviewing of a program. So, and after action review, please remember this term, after action review, AAR, is a meeting conducted to look back at the entire process of planning and execution. It allows us to identify what went well and what can be improved on in future. This allows each department to share their views and concerns about the entire program. So the balance, a review is important because it provides us with a learning process and acts as an archive for future planning teams to reference from. So example, for if you are planning for an open house, right, this year, and if you, after the event, you discuss with each appointment, each committee, so maybe safety will come out with things that might have actually happened, or maybe the logistic teams can come out with a more, like a way to save resources. So these are pointers that you can include in your AAR. So in future, if your juniors have to plan for the same activity like open house or games day, they can reference from your AAR session from whatever you have consolidated. So basically it saves time and your juniors can learn from past mistakes or what was good in your plan. So these are the questions that can be considered prior to an AAR to facilitate discussions. So before your AAR, you can think about it. And I'm sure if during an event, if something bad happens, you will probably reflect on it, right? Like what can I possibly do better? So these are things that you can think about and maybe share it with your fellow committee members. So in future, if you have to plan for a similar event, you take note of it. So this is this is just essentially the point of your AAR. Okay, so now that I have shared about program planning, does anyone have any questions? Because after this, we'll do an activity, but I just want to check whether everyone is clear so far on the content.